Great, great, great. Well, welcome everyone to our final installment of The Good Book, Sunday School Stories Through Grown-Up Eyes. This week we're going to be doing The Tower of Babel. And I'm super fired up about it. So let's begin with a prayer that we've been praying from the prayer book, our collect about the Holy Scriptures. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all Holy Scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen. All right, well, we have come a long way, and if you've been with us from the beginning, you know, there's been it's been kind of a deep dive, and I'm assuming it's been edifying because you're all back for week 4. So we've done a lot of kind of looking at the meaning behind the meaning of these stories, and the ways that there can be so much that's being communicated in these ancient stories, not simply by the story that it's telling, but the way that story is edited, how it's arranged, what it's alluding to. And we've really kind of seen that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are of a piece. Essentially, the hinge in the book of Genesis, if you looked at it kind of from the highest viewpoint out, is chapter 1 through 11, and then chapters 12 through 50. And I'm going to show you a video that kind of explains all that a little bit. But I was thinking we'd start. I'm always interested to know what people are bringing into the room. And this one isn't as memorable as like Noah's Ark or Cain and Abel, but I'm kind of wondering, what do you guys already know about this story about the Tower of Babel? And just throw a hand up in the chat box and Sarah can catch you, or you can just unmute. All right, good. So we're coming at it cold. Sarah, what do you know about the Tower of Babel? Like, when you hear that as a preacher that deals with the Bible, like what is your connection to this story?
I think like hubris, like human hubris, to try and build this like really tall tower that would be an access point to God. And I don't remember a lot of the details of the story that led up to that, so I'm interested in your take on it. But like, that's like my general sentiment of it, is that this is human beings who, wanted to connect with God and thought that they could do that work by building this tower. And then the kind of chaos and loss of language and identity when everything crumbled. That there was just a scattering of the people and of their understanding of one another when it all fell apart. I saw Linda was about to mute. Linda, did you have a thought you're going to share?
Yeah, it was what I learned about it as a child was they were building a tower to heaven, which was naughty. And so to stop it, everybody spoke a different language.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, broad strokes, absolutely. That's what you're looking at with this story. But as Sarah,
sorry, in the chat box, Kathy Austin put, this is fantastic, an early UN where everyone had translation software. That's pretty cool. Karen Craven says humans can do anything when they work together and are of the same mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, love it. Love all of this. Okay, I'm delighted. So let's dig a little deeper here. Kind of like Sarah alluded to, we're learning very much that context matters and can add meaning and layers of interpretation. So some of the things we've learned about reading Genesis with ancient eyes is that, to remember, it was written down while Israel was in exile. Where were they in exile when much of this was written down, or where, or after, when they had come out of exile? Do you remember where they were? Babylon. That's right. Which already might make you go, that sounds similar to like the title of this story, right? So we've learned about how these ancient authors are paying attention to things that might actually, or they're in conversation with other stories around them, and particularly ones that are threatening their the stories of their people, and they're trying to protect their culture. We read Genesis as part of the whole of Torah, and actually in this case, we're going to extend it through the whole of the Old Testament. And so there's ways that like these stories that are being told in Genesis are supposed to be seen as part of a whole, and like the people that are writing them are very aware of the rest of the content of the books, and so sometimes that can actually aid in interpretation, which is we'll see a little bit of today. Pay attention to the things like the design patterns. We talked about how these are these ancient backward stories of a primitive people that believed in fairy tales and myth are actually pretty stinking sophisticated. They're some pretty elaborately constructed works of art and poetry, and they're very much interested in things. So some of those things are narrative beats. You'll find similar narrative beats playing over and over again, like the same kind of story and language will show up in different places, and you're supposed to recognize it from before. We talked about remembering that numbers in the Jewish consciousness of the Bible were not quantitative, they are symbolic. So most of the time when numbers show up, it's not trying to tell you how big or tall or long something is, it's doing something else. Remembering that the writers of these ancient stories are really interested in different questions than modern readers are interested in. So, the notion of, well, where are the dinosaurs in Genesis 1 through 11? That's a great question. No one that wrote Genesis 1 through 11 was interested in dinosaurs. They have something else they want to tell you about. So we want to try to read these texts through ancient eyes and recognize that even if they're not answering modern questions, that does not mean they are not relevant or true, as I hope we will show today as well. So I want to show you this cool thing, speaking of the design patterns and how this stuff is built. And this will be germane when we get to this Tower of Babel itself as a story. One of the other things happening in the structure of Genesis is Genesis 1 and 2 is that sort of like God created the world, and there's two different poems that are kind of addressing different things. Genesis 3 happens, and sin and death are introduced into this creation. And what you find is that there are basically three not identical, but like similarly constructed fall narratives that use the same kind of language. We've pointed this out and stuff before the flood. So we have Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and then that weird story about the Nephilim, like taking the daughters of man and having children, and then those children becoming the great kings of old, that whole kind of thing, giants in the land. And then there's the flood, which was God's like cosmic reset button. And then there's three more fall narratives. One about Noah, one about Noah's sons, and then this last one is a Tower of Babel. This will become germane to us because what you'll see is, as you might have guessed, the first three fall narratives correspond with things going on in the last three fall narratives. So again, pretty sophisticated for a bunch of super primitive and backward people that just don't have science and really don't understand how the world really works like we do today. Just saying. All right, so to give you another sound, this is such a great summation. This feels like the right time to do it. I want to show you this video kind of about the hinge dynamic in Genesis that we talked about, and kind of the big picture of what's happening in chapters 1 through 11 before we read about the Tower of Babel. Oh, and I may not have that. Can you hear it?
It's very low
Hold on.
in volume. Sorry.
Cool. I'm trying to, if I made it so you can hear it when I shared my screen. I probably did not. All right. Yeah.
The first book in the Bible is a book you've probably heard of. It's called Genesis.
Genesis comes from a Hebrew word. It's pronounced reshit, and it just means beginning.
Now, there's a lot of stories from the book of Genesis, and it's easy just to pull out a specific story and try to tell you what it might mean. But we think the best way to understand this book is to look at the book as a whole and show you how the whole thing is designed.
The book is designed to fall into two main parts. You have chapters 1 through 11, which is telling the story of God and the whole world. And then you have the second part, which is about God and Abraham's family, as chapters 12 through 50. And how the two of those parts relate, that's where you find the message of the book.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning. The first part of Genesis begins with a creation story where God creates everything.
And how exactly that happens, of course, that's where all the debates come. But he takes a dark, watery chaos and he turns it into a beautiful garden where humans can flourish.
That sounds nice.
It does sound nice. In fact, 7 different times God says of all that he's made that it's good.
And this is where we meet the first human characters in the Bible, Adam and Eve.
They're both individual characters, but they're also representative. Adam is the Hebrew word for humanity, and Eve is the Hebrew word for life. And God creates them in his image. In other words, humanity reflects, or is meant to reflect, the creativity, the goodness, and character of the Creator out into the world that he's made. And they're supposed to reproduce and make cultures and neighborhoods and art and gardens and everything else. But he gives them a moral
choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And this is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about.
And he tells them, don't eat of the fruit of this tree or you will die. What's that all about?
So up till now, God has been the one defining and providing what is good. And so God is the one with the knowledge of good and evil. But now this tree represents a choice. Will the humans trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize the opportunity and define good and evil for themselves?
And Adam and Eve eat the fruit.
This is the core biblical explanation for that concept of sin, that desire to call the shots myself. It's the inward turn of the human heart to do what's good for me and my tribe, even if it's at the expense of you and your tribe.
And the problem is humans are horrible at defining good and evil without God. And so now that humanity's made this choice, things get really
bad. So Genesis 3 through 11 is like tracing this downward spiral of all humanity. So Adam and Eve, they can't trust each other anymore. And so there's a little story about how they were naked and felt fine about it beforehand, but now they feel shameful because all of a sudden Adam's definition of good and evil might be different than Eve's, and so they hide from each other.
Then there's another story of temptation. Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, and he gives in and kills him.
There's a story right after Cain about a guy named Lamech, and all we know about Lamech is that he accumulates wives like property, and he sings songs about how he's a more violent, vengeful person than Cain ever was, and he's proud of it.
Things get so bad with the human race that we see God decide to just wipe us out.
Yeah, we typically think of the flood story is about God being angry, but it actually begins with God's sadness and grief about the state of his world. And so out of his passion to preserve the goodness of his world, he washes it clean with the flood.
But there's a glimmer of hope. He chooses Noah and his whole family, and he saves them on this boat.
Yeah, don't forget about the animals.
Right, and the animals. So Noah and his family are going to reboot all of humanity. I mean, he must be a pretty great guy.
But this is the story most people don't know because it's kind of weird, is that Noah gets off the boat and he plants a vineyard and he gets totally plastered, and then something sketchy happens in his tent with his son. It's a tragic story.
So from here, humanity grows again, but things are as bad as before. And the last story is the famous story of the Tower of Babel.
And in this story, you have all of the nations uniting together to use this new technology they have, the brick. And they want to make a name for themselves and build this big city with a huge tower that will reach up to the gods. But God knows that this city will be a nightmare. And so in his mercy, he scatters them. And all of these stories, they're underlining the same basic idea. When humans seize autonomy from God, when they define good and evil for themselves, it results in a world of tragedy and death.
And this leaves you wondering, is there any hope for humanity?
Yes, yeah, there is. It's the very next story that answers that question. It's the beginning of God's mission to rescue and restore his world.
All right. So you just sort of get that sense, that big picture narrative sense, and how this story really is. I mean, it's like immediately following this story, you get the genealogy that takes you to Abraham, or to Abram, who will become Abraham, which is pretty cool. So speaking of genealogies, we have to read one of our own, because to understand the Tower of Babel story, we have to go back to everyone's favorite chapter and most famous chapter in Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations. So stretch out. I'm about to read a bunch of really old names, but I'm not making you read it, so that's kind. Except maybe Kathy. She's on my screen, so if I get lost, Kathy, I'm coming after you. So I want to invite you, while I read this, to again pay attention like we have the whole time. If you got a notepad, jot down what sticks out to you. What questions does this story surface? What is offensive or troubling or even cliche? And we will ask you all for some feedback after I read it. So here we go. Oh, I'm going to have to shrink my viewfinder. I always forget about that. Let me see if I can pull it off here. Hold on. Your old teacher's having a hard time here. All right, here we go. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittites, and the Rodanites. From these, the maritime people spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. For anyone looking for a life verse, consider the maritime peoples verse. The sons of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush: Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteca. And the sons of Rama: Sheba and Dedan. I've actually practiced this, and I still am getting hung up on it. Kush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first, like you do, everybody knows that. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land, he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. Egypt was the father of the Ludites, the Anamites, the Lehabites, the Naphtuhites, the Pathrasites, the Calicites, from whom the Philistines came, and the Caphtorites. Canaan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Architites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. We should capture the audio of this, Sarah, and make it my ringtone. Later, the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon as far as Gerar, and and as far as Gaza, and then towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Adama, Zeboim, and as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. Sons were also born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. The sons of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, I had to look that one up, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, Meshech. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah the father of Eber. And the two sons born to Eber, one was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. His brother was named Joktan. Joktan was I love how there's this explanation. You're like, what does that mean? Like, oh yeah, because of the divided earth. What? Joktan was the father of Almadad, Shelopheth, Hazar, Maveth, Jerah, Hadoram, Uzal, Diklah, Obal, Abiamel, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. These were all the sons of Joktan. The region where they lived stretched from Mesha to Sephar in the eastern hill country. These are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages, in their territories and nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their line of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out all over the earth after the flood. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. So that's a whole lot. I'll leave the Tower of Babel slide up. If anyone wants to roll back to the Table of Nations, I'm happy to. What are some things that stuck out to y'all, or questions that this surfaced, or regrets you have listening to me badly pronounce ancient Semitic names?
Dixon?
Yeah.
Hey, this is Stacy. So I'm wondering about in chapter 10, it seems like I've heard that one of the justifications for slavery was that people of color were descended from Ham, I believe.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Is
Yeah.
that true? And I just happened to notice in that chapter that the sons of Ham are associated with Canaan, the Philistines, and Sodom and Gomorrah. I just wondered if there are any connections.
Love it. Okay, so you're right about the slavery thing, and I think that's kind of like it's a later sort of justification. That's not what the writers of the text are doing. I mean, I can't remember how that all folds in or how they use that. What you are correct in noticing is that in the sons of Ham are all of Israel's enemies. Did you notice that? It's like all the great enemies, including, of course, Babylon, but also Nineveh, like places that we've been before in other stories, like in the Canaanites. And the reason that this is significant is because in the Noah story, like after the flood, it's the three brothers are the ones that encounter their dad naked and ashamed in the drunk in his tent. Japheth and Shem go in backward and throw the blanket over him and honor the nakedness, but Ham is like, whatever, it's not a big deal, right? So like he doesn't care about, and this is again like echoing Adam and Eve being naked and recognizing it and being ashamed. Like for Ham, he has no shame. And so there's this narrative thing where they're basically tracking, oh yeah, all of the Israelites enemies in the world, they all come from this guy because he's been soiled from the beginning, right? Their origins are in sin. It's a little bit of trash talk, right?
Is that related to the sins of the fathers will be visited on 7 generations or something like that?
That's a good question. I know, I mean, certainly that's part of like the 10 words at Sinai. I don't know. I would have to look. That sounds though like the kind of thing they would do, and point out, because we're seeing the kind of cascading nature of sin. It's part of what these stories are saying. They're like, look, this thing can get a head of steam and get away from you if you don't master it, if you don't pay attention to it and resist it. Like it will take you where it wants to take you. I love it.
A couple of comments in the chat just to share aloud to everybody. Jane said that her just general impression, God looks a little threatened here, which is one of those just gut reactions, right?
Great.
And then Tina says, now I know where the term babble came from when someone is talking and they go blah, blah, blah. Yep.
Yes.
Where it comes from.
And you're going to see actually even the word Babel gets played with here by these ancient authors. I love it. Yes. I mean, God, what's the deal with this? Like, why is God dissuading them from doing what it seems like God told them to do, which was to like come together and rule and subdue this earth and like, work together. It feels like there's this all the nations of the world working together in unity. That feels kind of like a good thing. Like, why is it a problem? That such that God would like actively work to frustrate it. They're moving eastward. They're going out into the world, spreading out over the earth, like the original Genesis story. What is it about this story that makes us say that this is a bad thing? Like what is going on with that? Excellent. I love it. I hope that you're asking different questions in week 4 of this class than you would have in week 1, because these are great questions.
It says that it reads as if the tower was finished, not the city.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and paying attention to details like that, like where is there, some sense of brokenness or unfinishedness, and where is there not, and yeah, like how does that shape the story?
Well, let me. I don't know if I'm going to come back to this. I'm just going to mention it now. Oh no, I got it later. Okay, so yeah, I'm coming back to that. I'm totally coming back to that. So let's start back with Genesis 10, okay? And this table of nations. Basically, all of those names I read to you are like the people groups of the known world for these ancient Jewish authors, right? And it's basically, you can kind of see it's like their neighbors to the west, and then it's most of the people groups ringing the Mediterranean, right? So we've got Greeks in there. You've got the Mizraim is Egypt. As I say, somebody else's. Anyway, so you've got all these kind of people groups, and what shouldn't surprise you is that of these people groups, there's a specific number of names that we read. Okay, so like it's the account of Noah's 3 sons, right? Shem, Ham, and Japheth. If you count all the names up, the sons of Japheth, the sons of Ham, and the sons of Shem, guess how many it adds up to? Right, 70. All right. So, which now you're like, oh, 70, yeah, the two dominant numbers from Genesis 1, the 7 days of creation and the 10 speech acts that God uses to create the world. And so there's something that's going on here where basically because these are not all the peoples in the world. Like verse 5 talks about the maritime peoples that spread out in their territories by clans within their nations. Like it's acknowledging there's other people on the earth. This is not trying to comprehensively name something. 70 is that kind of number of like grand completeness. So what this table of nations is trying to do is establish that what's going to happen with this group of people and with where the story goes is some sort of reflection on all of humanity. Like we're trying to say something about everyone right now, and we're taking some swipes along the way. But that's part of what's going on with that. It's a typological number that's invoking that idea of comprehensiveness, like on a large scale. Like they do it again at the end of the book when Jacob goes to Egypt. It talks about the household of Jacob is 70 families. So they're obviously way bigger than that, but it's again that was this sort of symbolic way of talking about wholeness. Now, if it's saying something about all of humanity, what's some of the stuff that it's saying? Okay, well, first off, this table of nations affirms that all human beings have a common origin, and there's an absolute fundamental unity of all humankind. Right now, this is something that I think we certainly take for granted theologically. Like on this side of the incarnation, we're like, oh yeah, that was like the Jesus thing. Like that's the Christ mystery about how we're all completely connected. There is no division. Like the surface level that we think are the divisions that we try to cook up and bring into our world to like divide ourselves. Like that is laying on top of a fundamental unity of all human beings, of all tribes, right? So we're not totally shocked by that, but think about it too. Scientifically, this is before like the Human Genome Project. We know actually all human beings came from a common source. Like we kind of know that that's actually a thing scientifically too. In the ancient world, people didn't know that. Right? Most national mythologies were about how their tribe was the only true humanity and everybody else was subhuman, right? Which made them worthy and easier to kill and pillage. So this story, even in its like swipes at Israel's enemies, even in its reflection of human sin, there's a recognition of that all of us are in this together. And there's something about the family of God that is a global family and always has been, right? Okay, so now let's talk about the fact that there are separate languages. This, I don't think I highlighted it, but Genesis 10 talks about all these people groups having their own languages. But then we get to Genesis 11. Did you notice the world had one language? Like what happened? Like what's the deal with that? Well, the deal is basically Genesis 11 is like a flashback to how we got to Genesis 10. Like how did all these nations of the world get their own languages? Oh, well, here's this story. So they're drawing on a contemporary reality and telling this story as like a flashback for some of that, right? Now, let's talk about this guy in verse 8, Nimrod, right? Kush was the father of Nimrod, all right? Now, Nimrod, it is said, is a mighty warrior. In Hebrew, this word is Gibborim. Do you know where you've seen Gibborim before? Those Nephilim, the giants in the land that took the women and had come from the women and who represented the kind of false demigod leaders of all the other nations, right? Who were not true gods, but if their leaders were claiming to be gods, well, they're coming from these false gods, these weirdo Nephilim. Nimrod is identified as one of those, right? Which again, when it says that he established his kingdom, what's the first one that they mention in verse 10? Babylon, right? So Babylon and Enuma Elish, their national mythology was that their rulers were God and that everybody else was not. And this is, again, a very direct and pointed reference by these Hebrew exiles that are stuck in Babylon to say, yeah, the emperor, the king, whatever they called him, the leader who calls himself divine, if he's divine, he's one of these false gods. He's not the true God. Our God is the true God, which is kind of cool. Again, trash talk, but also recognizing that like whatever the peoples in these cities get up to, it might not be so good because its roots are toxic, right? Last thing about names and languages, Shem is where the word Semitic comes from. And it's a cognate of the Hebrew word Hashem, which is the name. And again, this story of Babel is about people that are trying to do what with their tower? Make a name for themselves, right? So all of this is like echoing around in this story. Okay, so let's talk about, so when we get to the Tower of Babel itself, right? I talked about that. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to move forward. I think, am I moving forward? Hold on. I don't want to miss. Oh yeah. Okay. I'm good, y'all. I'm good. So we get to Genesis 11. The whole world had one language and a common speech. The Hebrew is, they were all had the same lip and unified words. And of course they go and build for themselves bricks, and those bricks, they use those bricks to build a tower, and they're building, it's part of them building a city. So let's talk a little bit about some of this. First off, where they're doing it, the Plane of Shinar, this is actually where like the oldest human civilizations are. And so like Shinar was a place that was known to be like where the first cities cropped up. But I forget it was who it was that mentioned it, talking about the city and the tower, and being like, wait, what's the deal with the city? Is the city not built? What about the tower? Well, let's think, when we think city, who built the first cities in our story here? It was Cain that builds the first cities, all right? Because he goes out from Eden. And remember that he builds them because he's getting it wrong again. God sends him out to be a wanderer, and Cain's like, I'll go build a city. So like city has this echo of like, oh man, like we're doing it again, aren't we? It's happening again. They're going to build, like cities are suspect in this narrative. And by the time we get to Revelation, it's a little bit different. All right. But also they built this city and this tower out of bricks. Okay. The word bricks in Hebrew is the Hebrew word for Babylon all mixed around. So it's like this total like play on like for a brick to show up, they're absolutely making like a play on words there. I thought that was really cool. Like this is interesting. But also like the video talked about, bricks are a new technology. And this technology is allowing people to do something they've never done before. And one of those things is to make empire. And so they're making empire and they're building these cities. And the thing is about bricks is if you've ever tried to like build any sort of like a wall or anything like in your backyard or your garden, and you didn't use pre-cut bricks, it's hard. Like stacking rocks is tough. But as soon as you introduce like bricks that can be mass produced, they can have mortar to hold them together, like you can build some stuff you've never been able to build before with this new technology. You can make the walls taller, you can make them faster. And of course, as soon as they're able to do that, they're like, we've got this new technology, like let's build a tower up to the heavens. Remember, God's up there. Let's get up there on our own and make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the whole earth, right? Well, aren't you supposed to be going across the whole earth? So you can see how this endeavor is actually starting to work in reverse of what God is asking them to do. Incidentally, what did Israel make for Pharaoh in Egypt? Bricks, chocolate. No, it's bricks. Bricks is what it is, right? So I don't know. I feel like I'm fire hosing too much here. All right, so now the tower that they build it's a ziggurat, and this was kind of like these tiered towers in the ancient world. But this is so cool. Okay, so the way that the text frames it is that they wanted to build this thing with up a tower to the heavens. I think it says the top in the heavens. I can't actually see it. Hold on. How's it saying? A tower that reaches to the heavens. Okay, so there's this really cool thing in the way that the Hebrew is rendered there, that basically the word tower, like the that's in the heavens that reaches up, it's the same word as the Hebrew word for head. And so there's this thing where like the description of the tower and how it's being built is also kind of echoing in the ancient world the image of a person, a human being with their head in the clouds, like literally building like a huge person. Okay, so let me ask you, Bible people, can you think of a story in Israel's past where the ruler of an oppressive nation built a statue of themselves that was huge and asked everybody to bow down to it? Does that sound familiar at all? Reverend Archergrave, you look like it's registering.
That is sounding very familiar. The story of Pharaoh, right? No?
Close. Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel. Yes.
That's right.
Seriously, stop calling on me.
Well, but like, isn't that after the Tower of Babel?
Yeah. So it's like,
Like,
yeah. And where is that story happening? Where are the people of Israel? It's Daniel, right? This is from the book of Daniel. Where is Daniel? He's in Babylon.
okay, so it's not like, you're not talking about something that like if the Tower of Babel is post-exile.
So yeah, so like all of this experience, first of the writings of Daniel and the whatever Nebuchadnezzar was up to, like that inspired the visions that are recorded in Daniel and the way that they told those stories while they were in Babylon, they are being written back into this story, right? Because all of those things, kind of whatever the historical events were, but as well as like the stories themselves existed before this got written down. And so those symbols are woven back into it. In Daniel 2, Pharaoh has a vision about a tower that reaches to the heavens. It looks like a person, and it's representative of all the symbolism of the different empires that will come after them. And do you know where this tower is erected before the stone comes and breaks the clay feet? The Plane of Shinar, which is not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible except Genesis 11. So this is why you read this story as like a negative story. You're like, oh, all the imagery of it is about the way that empires want to promote themselves and raise up their name and unify the human species around their name and not God's, building a tower to themselves in their name. Ladies and gentlemen, have we come very far in this world? Right? So all of that I find very, very interesting and maybe too Bible geeky for everybody else. But it's one of those things where it's like the difference that these authors are trying to point out is like, we are all one human family. Like we are all in this together, but the way we unify, if we don't do it in God's way, it comes out all broken and gross and tragic, right? Because here's the thing, empires can unify vast groups of people. Through the threat of violence and coercion, and oppression, they can get everybody to play along. I mean, in Jesus's time, what was the peace that was on offer by Rome? The Pax Romana, right? Which was great. It was, and they called it peace through victory. Well, yeah, that's a great peace depending on what side of the sword you're on, right? Like, we've got peace. No one's acting up because we're going to kill everybody, right? And so there's what you're seeing in this ancient story is this deep human temptation to use our technology and our ability to rally people around a cause to build a name for ourselves and to unify people around something that ultimately is destructive. It's like the wrong name. It's like they're trying to do the right thing the wrong way. It was sort of like Adam and Eve eating the fruit. Like, they were supposed to know good and evil, and God had a plan for that, but they chose their path for it, right? It's also interesting in the way that how I showed you those, like, I think I might have it here. Hold on. The structure stuff of the narratives. If this is the third of the last three fall narratives, the third of the first three is that weird story about the Nephilim, which was about the merging of heaven and earth, but the inappropriate merging, where like these spiritual beings or whatever are coming down and like, basically taking the daughters of man and creating this sort of merging of divine and human, but outside of God's plan. This is the opposite direction. It's human beings trying to move up toward the divine realm inappropriately in a way that makes their own name. So it's like the whole thing is like showing you this Babylonian ideal of empire, which was to unify humanity around an imperial dream and elevating one city's name to the heavens, is super, super dangerous when it comes to how we arrange ourselves in this world and how we participate in its healing. So I'm going to stop there because I've just said a lot of things. And before I offer sort of a little bit of a homiletical turn, I'm going to ask and actually answer Karen's question about why does God seem threatened in this narrative? What questions do you have?
That was Jane's question, actually, about the God seems threatening. And
Okay.
Another question, so one of which you've already answered from John Shields about the building material, the bricks versus stone. But he also asks, to close the loop on the conversation we just had about Daniel, it's a question I have too. So Genesis and Daniel are written around the same time?
I would have to check like the precise stuff, but both of them are kind of coming together in and after exile. So they're playing, these two are absolutely playing off each other. And Daniel's like a super weird, tricky book in its own right because it's apocalyptic. But I guess the point I'm just trying to make is the authors of each are aware of each other.
Sure. Yeah. Like it's a conversation back and forth.
Yeah. Because Genesis is part of the whole thing.
Yeah. That's helpful. Any other questions for Dixon? Not seeing anyone unmuting.
Does anyone want me to read the genealogy again?
Why don't you go ahead and talk about how the God being a little threatened?
Yeah.
In this story.
So basically, like you've got this story where human beings are going to set their mind to something that they are going to be able to accomplish. Like they have enough agency in this world to rally people around an imperial dream and unify people around a story that is not God's story. And so what you see is that comes about through a new technology, right? In this case, it's the brick, right? But it sort of starts to make you go, oh, like, yeah, everything that's old is new again. I mean, has anyone else ever noticed a time in human history where someone invented a new technology and they used it to glorify their own name or to build their own empire or to like oppress others. Yeah. All of a sudden this isn't ancient at all, is it? It's like this temptation is primal, deep in the human experience. I mean, and that's kind of the thing where you imagine somebody that like was like grew up farming in the rural lands around Babylon, and then they walk into the city and they're like, I've been trying to build stone walls, just piling stuff up to keep my sheep and my goats in a pen, but I'm looking at this city with these bricks and what they can build, and they're huge and it's massive. I mean, it would take your breath away the first time you saw a city like that. And it's like, oh my gosh, like it's awe-inspiring, but it also would be terrifying, because you're like, well, like if they can do this, like what else could they do? And if they could use this technology to build this brick, do you think they could do something to me with it? Right? I mean, imagine if there was like a weapon that was so destructive it could destroy the earth we're living on, and like one country had it but like others didn't, and like it like would create, it might like really make people nervous, especially because like if the country that had that kind of technology had actually used it, and they were like the only people in human history that had ever used it, and so like everybody else sees them and is like, will they use it again? Will they not? Like, how does it work? That would create some like seriously primal anxiety, wouldn't it? It would create a threat to true peace. And so there's this thing that you see in this story, that God is not threatened by what the humans are up to. God knows if they get their way, it's going to destroy this whole thing. And like that's the alarming, the threatening and invigorating takeaway from Genesis 1 through 11 is that like for the world to be a world, it has to be free enough to be a world. Meaning human beings are given enough agency to wreck this thing if we choose to. We can put an end to ourselves and the planet. There is a God that will work to frustrate our efforts, because this God is about mercy. And this God is like, I'm caring for you. But this God also, like we are free enough to be, we're that free. We are that free. But here's the thing. That also means if we're free enough to break this thing, we are also free enough to work with God to heal it. And there is more energy moving toward its healing. There's actual divine energy toward putting all the pieces back together, toward like the hearts of human beings long to be rallied together in community, not around an imperial name or around someone's ego, but to be rallied together around a greater good and purpose. Like that's the stuff that stirs you. Like when you hear somebody be like, you talk to you and say that, you know, there's a greater purpose for humanity than the strong dominating the weak, and getting whatever you can by any means necessary. There's actually a higher ideal. And like the thing that stirs you in that is that true truth about how we're made, and that we have agency and power to actually make this world more like that and to live that way. All of which will of course come to fruition in Jesus, you know, and his path of way, truth, and life. So it's like, we are still making this world. What are we going to make of it? And I'll leave you with that in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Y'all, thank you so much for jumping in the deep end with me for these last 4 weeks. I'm really, really grateful, and so glad that, well, basically the people would show up so I could just like fire hose all this stuff that my wife doesn't want to hear about. I mean, don't bring it over here, Dixon. So I get geeky about this. Remember, if you are geeky about this stuff too, let me one more time put the resource list that I put together in the chat. And I can also email it to you if you're on like a phone and can't see it. But resources for reading the Bible literally. I deeply recommend to you the BibleProject.org. That's where those videos came from that I showed. It is just a huge treasure trove of amazing information, podcasts on all this stuff, videos on all this stuff, like short videos too, like 5-6 minuters. That if you find what's interesting to you, you can deep dive. It's really, really cool. And again, there's books in this resource list. Also, I think that's in the resource list, the Bible for Normal People podcast and Pete Enns' books, Genesis and Exodus for Normal People. They're written for like regular folks who are kind of intrigued by this stuff, but really don't feel like they want to go to seminary to have to dig into this stuff. So that's what I will leave you with, which is kind of